It's Saturday, March 2nd, 1996. A Baltimore, Maryland woman has plans to make a 3-hour drive to meet up with her mom and do some shopping at a mall in Virginia. She kisses her husband goodbye and hits the road with a full tank of gas. Her meetup time arrives and passes. That evening, her car would be found abandoned on the stretch of the Route 29 corridor, just 50 miles northeast of her destination. A white napkin on her windshield would communicate to motorists that she was experiencing car trouble. But her car was in perfect working condition, and 25-year-old Alicia was gone. Police and family had a bad feeling about this from the get-go, and in the days following, the Charlottesville, Virginia area would learn that Alicia was not alone. A predator was in their midst and had been escalating. Around 24 women had contact with him leading up to this fateful day in March, most without further incident. But Alicia would not have the same outcome, and to this day, her case remains unsolved. This is A Simpler Time True Crime, the murder of Alicia Showalter Reynolds and the mystery of the Route 29 Stalker. Alicia Faye Showalter was born on August 5, 1970, to Harley Showalter and Sadie Miller Showalter. She had a twin brother, and a few years later came along a baby sister. She was a gifted student, and that continued on after high school. In 1996, she was a fourth-year pharmacology doctoral student at Johns Hopkins University. She was working to develop a vaccine for a parasitic blood infection that was affecting millions of people around the world. She had been married for a year to her husband, Mark Reynolds, and together they resided in the Baltimore area. On March 2, 1996, she had plans to meet up with her mom to do some shopping. They were going to a mall in the Charlottesville area called Fashion Square. Besides catching up and spending some bonding time together, the plan was for her to find a dress to wear to her twin brother's June wedding. Mall trips are one of my favorite things to do with my mom, and so this really resonated with me because I can picture if we lived hours apart from one another, this would definitely be one of the things we would do to catch up. The drive was supposed to take about 3 hours. She was going to leave the Baltimore area and go from I-495, head west on I-66, and south on State Route 29 in Virginia. Now, one thing to note about State Route 29 is that it is a well-traveled road and a main thoroughfare. However, parts of it can get really secluded and just winds through farmlands in dense wooded areas. Based on the time she was supposed to meet her mom, she left a little before 7:30 to give herself some extra time. 10:30 arrived and Alicia had not. It wasn't like Alicia to be late, and Sadie recalled how she was really looking forward to this day of shopping, and she was just so thrilled that her daughter would drive all this way to meet her. 1996 was really kind of the beginning of cell phones, and not a lot of people had them yet. In this case, Alicia did not have one, but her mom had just gotten one earlier that year, and Alicia had her phone number written on a piece of paper for the drive. The purpose of this was that if she had gotten into any trouble, gotten lost, or anything created a barrier for her, she would be able to find a place to call her mom and alert her of when her ETA would be and what the next steps would be. By the time 11 a.m. rolled around, Sadie was very worried and called Mark from a payphone. He too was concerned, but he did note that it's kind of foggy and drizzly out, maybe she just slowed down and she was slowed down with some kind of accident, so give it a little more time, but call me back if she doesn't show up. So that's what Sadie did. She waited and she waited and she waited until 2 p.m., but then she gave up hope. Now, I will say the timeline after this 2 p.m. mark is kind of unclear as to what happened in the interim, but there are a few hours between when her mom gave up kind of waiting for her and then whenever her car was found later that evening. So let's get into that. At 6 p.m. that evening, a Virginia state trooper found Alicia's Mercury Tracer pulled off to the side of Highway 29, about 50 miles northeast of Charlottesville in Culpeper, Virginia. The car did not look like it had been in an accident or anything, but there was a white napkin tucked under her windshield wiper. This was not uncommon to do if you were experiencing car trouble. It was a way to signal to passing motorists and to signal to possible law enforcement coming on the scene that you ran into some car trouble, but you're working on getting it towed. That did provide some momentary relief for them because maybe it really was just as simple as car trouble, but the timeline didn't add up and that relief quickly faded. This would have been hours ago, so where was Alicia? Police evaluated that her car was in perfect working conditions with no signs of a problem. I will say I couldn't find any source material that said how this was determined, so I don't know if they realized that after they towed it away or if her car keys had been left in the ignition or in the car somewhere, but that's what's stated in all of the source material. None of this was sitting right, and police took it seriously immediately. Her mother feared abduction, and that would only intensify with the information that came to light the next morning. On the morning of Sunday, March 3rd, police set up a roadblock on Route 29 to stop drivers and ask them questions. What they were looking for were witnesses who may have seen Alicia, and they found some. At least 3 people described seeing Alicia that day, and they all had the same consistent story. They saw Alicia pulled to the side of the road, talking to a clean-cut white man in a dark-colored pickup truck. To them, it certainly appeared like she was having car trouble and that this man was assisting. Her hood was up and they were looking in together. Police were excited that people had seen her and seen someone who was possibly with her, as this was a huge lead. But they were about to get even more than they bargained for. That's because not only did they encounter people who saw Alicia and this man, they themselves had encountered this man. According to now retired FBI Special Agent Thomas L. Carter, 20 women came forward to say they had experienced a man trying to pull them over. They said the man drove a dark pickup truck. There's a few different renditions of what happened, but here are the common themes. This man would pull up behind them or next to them, flashing his lights and gesturing rapidly, trying to get them to pull over. He would usually yell, "Pull over, something's wrong with your vehicle," or something along those lines. He often would share that he could see sparks coming from their vehicle. He sometimes would call himself Larry Breeden. He had reddish-brown hair, and he tended to brush it back with his left hand a lot while in their presence. Some people saw a green tarp and toolbox in the back of his truck. In most of these instances, out of fear that something was terribly wrong with their car, especially with him talking about sparks, and again, no cell phones back then, most people did pull over. I really had to place myself at that time and think about it because I picture myself nowadays and I can't picture pulling over for a random guy on the highway. But that's because I know that I have a cell phone available, and if I was experiencing car trouble, I could get help without that man. So again, it may have been a simpler time, but was it a safer one? Most of the time, he would do the same routine. He would jump underneath the vehicle and appear to be conducting some sort of exam. He would then come back out after a period of time and report the mechanical difficulties he allegedly uncovered. Next, he would offer to drive them to the nearest payphone or offer to drive them home. According to a March 13th article published by Leif Smith of the Washington Post titled "Disappearance Sparks Fear Among Route 29 Drivers," at least half a dozen women got into his vehicle, and he did exactly as he said he would do, and dropped them at a payphone without further issue. One of the women interviewed by the paper was a 21-year-old college student who said this man flagged her down and told her there were sparks coming from her Toyota's transmission. She said he was very polite and disarmed her worry pretty quickly. She shared that he made her feel fearful to drive her car very far, and after repeatedly insisting he drive her home, she acquiesced. I just want to pause for a moment to say, it's okay to listen to that voice. As women, we sometimes don't want to make waves and we want to be polite, but in this case, you can tell this woman, even though she appreciated his concern, had said no a few times to him about a ride, but after he was insistent, she almost just felt like she had to give in and do that. To be clear, the only villain in this story is this man. I just simply want to mention that to empower people to listen to that voice. So this same woman brought her car to a mechanic who told her that there was actually nothing wrong with her car. She thought that was weird but didn't think a whole lot more of it until she heard about Alicia and the other instances in the news. After that, she decided to reach out to police. Now, I know I mentioned that most people actually did pull over, but what about those people who didn't accept help? Well, they saw a whole other side of this man. He would become enraged if they didn't pull over. He would pound his fist on the steering wheel. He would yell expletives. It was like a light switch had just flipped. With all the information they had collected, investigators came up with a chilling theory, or more of a two-part combo of both. He was either living out a sexual fantasy he had been building up until the act of dropping the woman off safely was not enough, or he was practicing these scenarios on women until he found the perfect victim. Alicia may have just become that victim when another attempt at violence had failed. 1 week prior to Alicia's disappearance, a woman who I will call Mary was driving on Route 234 near Manassas, Virginia. She was heading to Quantico, Virginia. This particular scenario happened in the evening, whereas some of these other instances primarily happened right in broad daylight. She recalled that a car pulled up behind her, flashing its lights. She pulled over because she thought it was someone she knew. When the man approached, he was very soft-spoken and even said things kind of along the lines of, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to scare you." He explained that there were sparks coming from her vehicle and offered to take her to a gas station a mile up the road. She got in his car, and she said he put forth a very trustworthy demeanor, which is exactly what these other witnesses were describing as well. However, once she got in the car, things got a little bizarre. She said that he kept slowing down and pulling over and then pulling back onto the road. When she asked about it after the first time, he blamed that there were bright lights behind him, making it hard to see, like somebody with their high beams on. It's nothing she noticed, but again, she didn't think too much of it. But then the second time, he blamed that there was frost on the windshield, and she was starting to get a little weirded out at this point. After doing it 3 times, she was really spooked, and she requested that he just take her to the gas station. At this point, he became violent. She stated that he shoved her head into his lap and demanded she hand over her purse. She continued to fight back, and as the struggle escalated, she said he began shoving her out the door while she was also trying to escape. In some variations of her testimony, she did say that he produced a screwdriver and placed it in her chest or neck area. As he was shoving her out and she was trying to get out, she became tangled in the chest strap of her seatbelt, and that made her get dragged for a bit as he drove the car until she was finally able to roll away and get to safety. However, she did injure herself and break her ankle in the process. Police listened to this, and how they interpreted him pulling over to the side of the road repeatedly was that they felt he was preparing to commit a crime, or maybe just building up the courage or trying to find the right spot for the crime to take place. They definitely felt it was connected to Alicia's case as well. Criminal profilers in the FBI came up with this psychological profile released in the week after Alicia's disappearance. Quote, "The man may be acting anxious and fearful. He may be bringing up Reynolds' disappearance in casual conversation or talking about it incessantly. He may have taken annual leave last week. He may have made a sudden change of appearance or may have changed cars suddenly. If someone recognizes that their colleague always drove the same black truck to work every day and is now driving a Volkswagen, that may be a clue," end quote. In addition, authorities did emphasize that this person was likely friendly with a family and blended into the neighborhood. He was likely one of those people that was a very helpful neighbor. The desperate search for Alicia continued. It turns out her driver's license was found on the day she went missing on Culpeper Street. This area is just a few miles northeast of where her car was found, back in the opposite direction of where she would have come from. This is off where Main Street intersects with Route 29 and goes into the main part of town. A few days later, her parka was found discarded in Madison County. A police scuba diving team searched the pond in that area, but nothing more was found. Alicia's family posted a $25,000 reward, and the Culpeper County Board of Supervisors posted a $10,000 reward. Community members in rural areas were asked to search their property. Her parents lit a candle in their window as a signal of hope, and community members did so in a sign of solidarity with her family. Alicia's husband Mark refused to give up hope. He showered and shaved every day just so that he would be ready in case his wife showed up. He drove up and down the roads of Culpeper looking for any clues to his wife's whereabouts. He kept a bag by the front door packed with items of Alicia's, ready to go in case he got a call that she was in the hospital or had been found wandering in the woods. I have read and watched a lot about different cases of crime over the years, and I oftentimes get moved to tears with the things I'm reading about. I have to say, though, in doing this podcast, this was the first time where I had to re-record something 5 or 6 times just to be able to record that without getting choked up. That commitment and hope that his wife would return safely was something that is so honorable and just really shows the testament of his love for her. Days turned into weeks, but on May 7th, just over 2 months after Alicia was last seen, a tragic discovery would answer some of the questions about her fate. 15 miles east of the site of the abandoned car, a utility worker in the town of Lignum saw vultures circling around a clear cut of land. As he went closer to investigate, he stumbled into Alicia's body. According to the book Trailed, One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders by Catherine Miles, she was found near a riverbank, partially buried and badly decomposed. And the area was so rugged and difficult to get to that they actually had to call in Shenandoah Park Rangers to be able to get to it. In none of the other news outlets was I able to find her cause of death, and they've been really quiet about it. However, in that same book I just mentioned, she, the author, had seen the state medical examiner's report where they did say asphyxiation was the cause of death. This book helped with research into this case, even though the primary focus of it is not this particular case. but I'll get more into that in a moment. The discovery of Alicia's body kicked this investigation into high gear because the Route 29 stalker had escalated to homicide. Police ended up tracking around 23 women who had interactions with the stalker in the month leading up to Alicia's abduction. He began in February of 1996. But here's the thing. After the abduction, it stopped. At least the ruse to pull women over on the side of the highway. And to this day, there's never been any sightings since. Nobody else in that area ever reported a man trying to pull them over or saying there was sparks coming from their vehicle or anything else. There was other crimes committed in this area that have a lot of overlap. And so depending on who you believe did this or which of the victims you think is related to Alicia's case, that can influence what you think happened with the person who was pulling over all of these women. Some people believe that he left the area. Some people believed he simply just switched up his MO. And some people believe he was just a one-and-done killer. There's a lot to unpack, but the best way to start doing so is to start with going through some of the suspects. The first suspect I'll discuss is Daryl David Rice. He first came on the radar as a prime suspect in the Shenandoah Park murders of Julianne or Julie Williams and Laura or Lolly Winan. Now, that's the case of the two hikers that are covered in the book I mentioned earlier, Trailed by Catherine Miles. Some other podcasters have dedicated amazing episodes to this case that I'm going to link to, and also the publication The Advocate did an amazing write-up on the beautiful lives of these two young women. But nothing goes more in depth and does a better job than Trailed. You have to read this book, so I'm going to link it in the show notes. In this episode, I just want to give a brief overview of what happened to them, just to understand why people make this connection to the case of Alicia. On May 19th, 1996, couple Julie and Lolly went camping with their golden retriever Taj. They were last seen alive on May 24th in the park. On June 1st, the bodies of both women were found in a remote campsite a quarter-mile from Skyline Drive. Lolly was found in the tent, and Julie was found in her sleeping bag 40 feet away down a small embankment. Both of them had their hands bound, mouths gagged, and throats slit. Both were partially undressed, but neither showed signs of sexual assault. There was some pieces of this crime scene that was similar to Alicia's case. For example, near where Alicia's car was found, there were cigarette butts and one black glove. At the Shenandoah site, there was a pair of black gloves as well as cigarette butts. Alicia's personal belongings had been scattered around the Culpeper area and near the town of Lignum. And at the crime scene in Shenandoah, the personal belongings of the two women were found scattered along the campsite as if they'd been rummaged through. Fast forward to July 9th, 1997, just over a year after the murders, a woman named Yvonne was cycling south on Skyline Drive in Shenandoah National Park when a man in a pickup truck began harassing her. He drove past her a couple of times and threw a soda can at her and sped away. Then he did a U-turn and continued to drive next to her. She got scared and drove down a side road where he followed her. He forced her off her bicycle, got out of his vehicle, and said, "I'm gonna get you." He also yelled some obscene sexual things at her, like asking her to lift up her shirt, though he said it in a more graphic way than I care to share on here. He continued to make movement towards her, and she ended up trying to block him with her bicycle, putting that as a barrier between them. He continued to proceed towards her direction, and she threw water bottles at him, before he finally got back in his vehicle and sped off. As he sped off, she took note of what his truck looked like and noticed that it was missing his license plate. She was able to flag by a nearby couple that was camping, and they went to get help from a ranger. It actually took a little bit of time for them to get the proper help they needed because some of the emergency phone lines in the park and the walkie-talkies weren't working. However, they did get help, and he was able to be stopped before he got out of the park. And I mean, like, just before he got out of the park. He was so close to making exit from the park, and then he got stuck behind a camper, and they were able to find him. He had placed the license plates back on his car, and he had changed his shirt, so he clearly knew that he had been in some trouble, and what he did was wrong. The switching out the license plate really got me, because taking it off in the first place really kind of hinted at some premeditation. In his truck, they found it to be just absolutely filthy. He hadn't cleaned it for a while. And in there were zip ties and a screwdriver. They concluded that he intended to use these on Yvonne in some sort of way. He ended up pleading guilty to this crime and got 135 months in prison. But backing up just a little bit, the reason he really got on police's radar for this was because of comments he made while in the vehicle with park rangers on the way to be questioned after the incident with Yvonne. In that car ride, he shared that his father lived in nearby Culpeper, and he talked about how he came to the park often. He even talked about how he encountered a bear on a recent bike ride there. He had talked about how his life had kind of hit a difficult time, and he was having trouble with substance abuse and with losing a job. Then, out of nowhere, he asked if they ever did catch the people who killed those 2 women the previous year. That, combined with the proximity of the homicides from the previous year, they really started to look at him as a suspect. They had him on camera entering the park on video surveillance on May 25th when the women arrived. He also visited the day after on May 26th, entering at a different surveillance point. He was also seen entering the park with friends on June 1st, the date the bodies were discovered. Police tried hard to make him the suspect of this case. They even planted a lot of jailhouse informants to try to get interviews where he admitted to the crimes. However, he never did admit to the murders in any type of recording, and oftentimes the inflammatory statements he made that were used against him were part of a broader conversation that didn't make any sense. Like, they were deliberately edited in a way to deceive people. So, just for example, prosecutors transcribed part of this interview and shared how he said to a jailhouse informant that he hated gay people. But the context they failed to include was the fact that he was actually responding to how police were trying to say that he hated gay people, but they clipped that all out. In fact, if they had continued on, he then went to say, I don't at all, and I was mad that they were trying to pin that on me, and they were trying to say that about me. Rice was actually charged in the double homicide, but the case was really weak and circumstantial. Then, in 2003, with DNA advancements, a hair found at the scene was tested. It did not belong to either woman, and it also didn't belong to Rice. He was excluded, and thus those charges were dropped. Based on just his interaction with Yvonne and other petty crimes he admitted to while in custody, Rice was not the best guy. But I also really just don't have the sense that he committed the Shenandoah murders, especially after finishing that book. But there is one more thing about Rice, one major thing. Remember the first woman who experienced the violent side of the Route 29 stalker but was able to get away? Police visited Mary at her place of employment in 2002 and showed her a photo lineup. She picked Rice out of that lineup and swore it was her attacker. So, when the charges fell through for the Shenandoah murders, investigators looked to get him for the Route 29 stalker cases. Specifically linking him to her attack, he was going to face life in prison. The problem is, when it actually went to trial, pieces of her story changed, and the defense argued that she had pointed the finger at other suspects in a photo lineup before. That's the main reason that I've used a pseudonym in this episode. This woman's name is published a lot, but I also feel like she has been through a lot. She has had her story questioned of the most traumatic night of her entire life multiple times, and she's even had her integrity called into question. This woman is purely a victim in this case, but it does pose a challenge when the different eyewitness accounts and pointing the finger at different suspects comes to play. She swears up and down that she never identified another suspect, but police say she did, so it's kind of their word against hers. I can't sit here and point out any truth for certain. I can sympathize greatly with this woman, and I imagine she has felt a desperate need to feel for herself that a suspect has been identified and that she is safe and he is locked away. Trauma can do a lot of things to the mind, and whether that desire for closure impacted her ability to identify or impacted her memory at all, I'm unsure about. But I can absolutely understand her need to feel some peace. In the end, with the case getting shaky, he entered an Alford plea. For those of you who are unfamiliar, this is essentially refusing to admit that you're guilty, but admitting that the prosecution has a decent case against you, probably enough to get you convicted. This usually sets up a plea deal. In this case, he was sentenced to 14 months in prison, running concurrently with the sentence he was already serving for the cyclist attack. It added no jail time, and he was released from prison in 2007. From what I can tell, he's currently still free. Now, anything I offer here is just my opinion. I really don't know if this is the man who committed the Route 29 stalker crimes. But a few things point me against it. For one, he doesn't have a very suave demeanor. As you can tell from the Yvonne attack, he just came right up on her and threw a soda can at her. He yelled obscenities, he didn't try to get her to bring her guard down at all, and that was like a hallmark piece of everybody who encountered the Route 29 stalker. Rice also had arguably some significant mental illness. It got brought up in his different trials, and people suspected he had schizophrenia, though it's unclear if he ever officially had that diagnosis. What was determined was he absolutely had his life falling apart leading up to this time frame, and he had trouble maintaining employment or really interacting with people in a social way, period. I just have a hard time believing that he would have the actual mental bandwidth, given the significance of his mental illness and his ways he was acting up to the crime, to be able to pull this off repeatedly on trial runs and then actually get away with it with Alicia. As with everyone I'm discussing with this case, he has never been named an actual suspect in the case or charged in any way connecting to Alicia's murder. The next suspect is the man that the defense in the Rice trial claimed that Mary had also identified for her crime before ever pointing the finger at Rice. His name is Richard Mark Ivanitz, and he is a serial killer. He was in the area at the time of the Route 29 stalker, and here's a little bit about his criminal history. In 1987, he exposed himself to a teen walking down the street with her 3-year-old sister. The mom of these 2 kids was not messing around, and she took down the plate. He was serving in the Navy at the time, and he actually just kind of got a slap on the wrist for that. He then became the prime suspect, but was never charged in the 1994 and 1995 rapes of 2 women in Spotsylvania County in Virginia. In September of 1996, he abducted teenager Sophia Silva from Spotsylvania County, Virginia. She had been seen after school doing her homework on her front steps, and then seemingly vanished into thin air without a struggle. Her books and everything just lay sitting there, but she was gone. Her body was found off Route 3 in King George County a month later. In May of 1997, 15-year-old Christy Lisk and her 12-year-old sister Katie Lisk were abducted from their front yard in Spotsylvania County, Virginia, after getting off the bus. Their bodies were found 5 days later in the South Anna River. There were definite parallels between the Shenandoah crime scene and the bodies of the Lisk sisters in terms of how they were bound and the marks on their bodies. They all had similar abrasions. None of this would come to light, though, until 2002. Up until this point, Evonitz was just free. But in 2002, in South Carolina, Kara Robinson was abducted from the front yard of a friend's house in South Carolina while watering flowers. I highly encourage you to go listen to her tell her own story in her own words, but she bravely snuck out of his house while he was sleeping and ran for help. If you actually read the account of how she went about doing this, you'll be even more impressed. It was absolutely terrifying because he had set up booby traps so that she would get caught if she tried to escape. Also had her in handcuffs that she had to free herself from in order to be able to get out. So her story is absolutely incredible, and she tells it on a few different platforms. I highly recommend you go listen. Once she was free, Evonitz knew the jig was up. He went on the run, and police closed in on him. But as they did so, he took his own life. As they went through his personal belongings after his death, they found a treasure trove of different items that connected him back to those previous crime scenes in Spotsylvania County. In the book Trailed, he is definitely the one that Catherine Miles points to as the probable killer of Julie and Lolly, but he has never definitively been tied to that crime. He was definitively tied to the murders of Sophia Silva, Christy Lisk, and Katie Lisk. Many people also believe he is the Route 29 stalker. However, there's a few things that steer me away from him too. For one, he doesn't really look anything like the sketch. I'll share photos of Evonitz and the sketch on the Instagram page at Simpler Time Crime Pod for you to check out. Not only that, but so many people have seen Evonitz on the news due to the notoriety of that case. Given how many people interacted with the Route 29 stalker, don't you think someone would have come forward and said, that's absolutely the man I got in the vehicle with, or absolutely the man who tried to pull me over? But from what I can tell, nobody has, and that's just a red flag for me. Lastly, Evonitz seemed to primarily target younger children and adolescents, and while Alicia did have a younger look to her and was just in her mid-20s, the Route 29 stalker had been targeting all adult women up to this point. So, the jury's still out on that one too. The year 2023 revealed one more suspect, and it actually came from the Showalter family. They saw the photos in the news of the person who was arrested as the Long Island serial killer. His name is Rex Heuermann, and sometimes he's referred to as the Gilgo Beach Killer. The Gilgo Beach serial killings were a series of killings between 1996 and 2011 in which the remains of 11 people were found in Gilgo Beach, Long Island. Most were sex workers who advertised on Craigslist. While the remains of Alicia Showalter Reynolds were discovered in Virginia in May of 1996, the partial remains of the earliest known victim tied to the Gilgo killer had been found in April of 1996. That's when 2 female legs washed up in the Davis Park community of Fire Island. That same victim's skull was discovered in 2011 during the Gilgo investigation on Ocean Parkway. Her name was Karen Vergata. At the time of the Route 29 stalker, Heuermann's mother lived in Palmyra, Virginia, and driving to her house from New York would have taken him directly through Culpeper. At the time of this recording, Police have continued to go through items found in Huerman's possession because he seemed to be someone who liked to keep trinkets of things. However, from what I can tell, there's no indication that there's anything found connected to Alicia or her crime, or any of the Route 29 stalker cases. The main reason people are looking into him is because of the resemblance to the composite sketch. I will also put this on the Instagram page, but if you compare the two of the composite sketch of the Route 29 stalker and the Rex Huerman mugshot, it's absolutely uncanny. But that's kind of where it ends. The sketch does make you do a double and triple take, but I think we'd need to identify that he was living in Culpeper during this time for him to have the volume of practice that he had. It wouldn't make sense that he'd be able to be living up in Long Island and also doing all of these practice runs that the Route 29 stalker was doing. Rex also had a very specific type of victim and was typically targeting sex workers, which was different than the MO of pulling people over on the side of Route 29. So, while Rex has not been ruled out, he hasn't been ruled in either. Nobody has. And the crimes all over this area of Virginia during this short period of time has left a lasting impact on the greater community. There's no telling at this point which ones are completely connected and which ones aren't, except for those that have already been proven in the Evonitz cases. Robert Ressler of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit concluded, quote, "The likelihood of all these being separate cases is rare. When you have female bodies showing up in close proximity in a short period of time, it's an unusual circumstance. If it is more than one killer, this part of Virginia has some real problems," end quote. But the more I read about the Route 29 stalker and the Alicia Showalter Reynolds case, the more I think that they do. In fact, it's quite possible that nobody I've even mentioned in this episode is responsible for this crime. For what it's worth, after Alicia's body was found, the same criminal profiler from earlier stated that he believed the murder was accidental and a sexual fantasy playing out gone wrong. It's so sad to think that the circumstances of time and place weighed so heavily on this crime. If the Route 29 stalker tried these same things today, what percentage of women would actually pull over now that they have phones available? What are the odds that area cameras wouldn't catch more detail of his truck or license plate? Someone would have snapped a picture. It's amazing to me that over 500 tips were called in regarding people who had seen this man, and 23 women saw him up close and personal, but he's never been identified. Hopefully, new advancements in technology will help bring Alicia's family the long-awaited answers they have been so patiently hoping for. If you lived in the Culpeper, Virginia area at the time and have any information, please come forward. You can contact the Virginia State Police Culpeper Division at 1-800-572-2260 or the Bureau of Criminal Investigation at 1-888-300-0156. You've been listening to A Simpler Time, True Crime. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find us on Instagram at SimplerTimeCrimePod. Getting information out there about these cases is most effective with more listeners, so please go tell your friends. And join us next Monday as we dive into another case. Thank you for listening.